Trade is important. Trade is important also for growth. However, when we look at the situation in Africa, we know that Africa is largely marginalized in world trade. Africa's share of world exports in 2018 was a mere 2.5%. 2.5% of world trade for the entire continent. And that is lower than the continent's share of global GDP, which was 3% in 2018. So these are very small numbers. Moreover, Africa's exports tend to be concentrated in a few unprocessed commodities. So we are talking about, obviously, the extractive industry, minerals, but also some soft commodities, some agricultural products. The problem with some of these agricultural products is that they do not have favorable terms of trade. So over the years, you may see a decline in the terms of trade shocks, which may lead to economic shocks, negative economic shocks in African countries. What is the cause of this situation? Back in the 1990s, there was a sort of a lot of interest in trying to understand what was causing Africa's marginalization. And one set of studies by a group of World Bank economists led by Yates and his colleagues, they investigate an entire range of factors, of policies, looking at which of these were responsible for Africa's marginalization in global trade. And what they find is it came as a shock at that time. They reached the conclusion that Africa's marginalization was largely due to its own trade policies, meaning Africa had a low share of world exports because of restrictive trade policies, which entailed an anti-export bias, which had the effect of dampening Africa's exports and preventing African countries from exploiting their export potential. In addition to the trade policies, you have other kinds of restrictive policies, especially restrictive policies in the transport sector, infrastructure. So this is ironical because if you really want to boost trade, if you really want to exploit the avenue that trade represents for economic development, we need to liberalize not just trade, but we need also to invest in infrastructure, and we need to also have more liberal transport policies. Africa trade is substantial. Currently, intra-Africa trade is about 15% on average. 15%, meaning if you were to look at how much Africa trade within itself, okay, that amounts to 15%. And believe me, this is very small. If you were to look at intra-regional trade in the European Union, for example, it is above 60%. If you look at some of the other regional blocks like Mercosur, ASEAN, okay, again, the intra-regional trade share is in excess of 20-25%. In Africa, 15%, that is low. In addition, so you can see the potential here, the potential that there is for Africa to boost trade, and that potential begins with intra-Africa trade itself. At 15%, there is a lot of unexploited potential. Moreover, we notice that intra-Africa trade is more intensive in manufacturers than is Africa's trade with the rest of the world. And that is shown here in the charts, okay? If you were to make the comparison, you will see that manufacturers represent a much higher share of intra-Africa exports than it does for exports to the rest of the world. What is the message that comes from this analysis? Well, I think the message is that regional integration can be a tool to foster industrial diversification in Africa. Because if because really, if regional integration is more intensive in manufacturers, then by boosting regional integration, by boosting intra-Africa trade, we will give a chance for manufacturing-based industrialization to flourish. But regional integration has other advantages as well. It helps to build regional economic infrastructure, foster food and energy security. It can generate jobs for Africa's population. It can help alleviate poverty and promote income. Talk about regional integration agreements in Africa. We can when we talk about regional integration in Africa, I think we cannot miss the talking about the Abuja Treaty. The AU's Abuja Treaty, which came in effect in 1994, sets out a roadmap for Africa to achieve an economic and monetary union by 2028. And the process is conceived in 6 stages. You have a chart in the course manual that shows the different phases. Uh, we can say that we are now beyond phase one. Phase now is complete. In phase one, the idea was to form regional economic communities and to start to consolidate them. Yes, we are past this phase. We currently have 8 regional economic communities that are officially recognized by the African Union. We are currently perhaps past phase three. Phase three involves the formation of FTAs at the REC level. So we are past that because we now have a continental FTA, and we are just shy of phase four, which talks about the establishment of a continental customs union. So you may think of phase four as the next step in the continental integration process. The continental FTA itself did not feature explicitly in the Abuja Treaty. When the Abuja Treaty was conceived, there was no talk of a continental FTA. There was a continental customs union was there, but the continental FTA was not. But at some point, it was deemed necessary as a step towards toward the continental customs union. So in other words, at some point, it was decided that a continental FTA was needed in this progression towards a continental customs union and ultimately towards a monetary, economic and monetary union. At the level of the RECs, the progress on regional integration is mixed. Some of them have gone further, others are lagging behind. We'll have an opportunity to look at this. It appears generally that deeper integration in Africa has been hindered by a lack of political commitment and resistance to trade liberalization on the part of some countries. There's also a lack of coordination at various levels, the level of ministries, at the level of across institutions and organizations also. Infrastructure deficiencies are still very much there, and they hinder intra. When it comes to assessing regional integration, I must say I find this very interesting and thankful that we have such an initiative. It's a recent one, the so-called Africa Regional Integration Index. Okay, it's an index that came about recently. It's a composite index of regional integration that tracks progress on regional integration in terms of 5 dimensions. So these 5 dimensions are what constitute the index. These are trade integration, regional infrastructure, productive integration, movement of people, financial and macroeconomic integration. On the chart, you will see the regional integration index scores for the 8 regional economic communities, as well as the average across the 8 regional economic communities. What you can see from the chart, I think it comes out quite clearly. You can notice that the East African community has the longest bar, so it has the highest score when it comes to regional integration. The, the East African community is known to be the front runner when it comes to regional integration on the continent. They have been doing very well, actually the best across all the 8 RECs. ECOWAS isn't doing too bad. It's just trailing behind the EAC. But then on the other hand, you see some of the RECs that have relatively low scores, in fact, lower than the average across the RECs. And 2 of them are SENSAD here and COMESA. What we also notice is that different regional economic communities show different degrees of progress on the 5 different dimensions of integration. So, for example, ECOWAS leads in terms of macroeconomic convergence and free movement of people, but it tends to underperform on trade integration. Okay, so you have such variation across the regional economic communities. We can look at regional integration. We can do a sort of a more detailed analysis, looking at trade and the share of trade that takes place within each of the regional economic communities. However, let me flag a note of caution here before we go deeper into this slide. We have to be careful when interpreting and using African trade data. And that is because a lot of African trade tends to be of an informal nature. And that means we are talking about trade that is not officially recorded. So to that extent, the trade data that we are using underrepresents the real volume of trade taking place across the continent, especially across borders among African countries. Having said that, what we have here on this graph is the intra-regional trade intensity. What is that? It is the percentage of a regional economic community's trade that takes place within itself. So basically, how much of EAC's trade that takes place within the EAC, meaning among the EAC countries. So this is not external trade, this is trade within the bloc. So as we noted earlier, the intra-Africa trade intensity averages 15%, close to 16% over the period here, over 2000 to 2017. And we argued earlier that this number, 16%, is on the low side, especially when you compare this performance with other regional economic communities, other trade blocs across the world. The EAC is the best performer. It shows an average trade intensity of more than 20%. What we see also is a sharp increase, the black curve here, you can see that. That's SADC, and you can see that SADC has come up in a very important way, okay? A sharp increase in intra-SADC trade, which places SADC next to the EAC in terms of the regional trade intensity. On the other hand, you have some regional economic communities where intra-block trade remains within 5%. And 2 of them, you can see them here. Okay? The green one is ECAS and the red one is the AMU. In 2018, the AU, the African Union, adopted a landmark protocol on free movement of persons, right of residence, and right of establishment. It's a very important protocol. However, Only 22 countries have signed the protocol, and only 4 of them have ratified it. So you can see that we talk a lot about promoting free movement of people on the continent, but when it comes to action, that is where we are lagging behind. Okay, only 22 countries have signed this protocol. There is room for more countries to join. One way to track movement of people is through the visa openness regime. So basically, how open is the visa regime among African countries? Uh, we can refer here to the visa openness report. Again, it's a laudable initiative by the African Development Bank, I think, which shows that progress in liberalizing visa regimes across Africa has been slow and variable, meaning different countries have been making progress at different rates. But on the whole, that progress uh, remains very low. On average, 25% of African countries offer visa free entry, and about the same percentage offer visas on arrival. ECOWAS leads on what is called open reciprocity, that is, no visa is required for African nationals visiting ECOWAS countries, followed by the EAC. So ECOWAS and EAC are really champions in visa-free travel on the continent. Other regional economic communities have to follow their example. On the other hand, IGAD and COMESA trail far behind ECOWAS and the EAC. So you can see there is much room for improvement when it comes to visa openness on the continent. The other component of regional integration, which is again one of the dimensions of the regional integration index as we saw it, is macroeconomic convergence. What is macroeconomic convergence? It's a process through which disparities in economic indicators are reduced towards agreed targets. Economic indicators such as inflation, budget deficit, public debt, and so on and so forth. Let us recall that the Abuja Treaty envisages as the ultimate step in African integration a monetary union with a single currency and an African central bank. Before we get there, however, we need to have a very strong and robust level of macroeconomic convergence across the entire continent. So why do we need macroeconomic convergence? We need it if we are to make progress towards a monetary union. Several regional economic communities have achieved deep integration through macroeconomic convergence. For example, there are 3 monetary unions currently in operation in Africa, uh, in West Africa, Central Africa, and the Common Monetary Area, which is SACU minus Botswana. And there are future monetary unions envisaged in other RECs. On the whole, however, progress on macroeconomic convergence at the country level remains mixed. And to finish with this first module, very briefly, let's talk about the road to the African Continental FTA. We obviously will have the opportunity to talk a lot more about this in the next modules. As we said before, the Continental Free Trade Area was officially launched in July 2019. Uh, as of January 2020, 54 African countries had signed the agreement and 30 of them had ratified it. The Continental FTA is seen as a key instrument in the African Union's action plan on boosting intra-African trade, the so-called BIAT, which was adopted in 2020. 12. BIAT envisages consolidation, it envisaged consolidation of the regional FTAs into a continental FTA. In practice, however, the process didn't work out this way. In practice, the continental FTA emerged as a separate initiative. So the idea was that the existing FTAs would consolidate and sort of band together to form the continental FTA. But in reality, the continental FTA was negotiated as a separate initiative, which explains why, along with the launch of the continental FTA, we have other FTAs. We still have the RECs, which are there. We still have the free trade, the tripartite FTA, which groups together the EAC, COMESA, and SADC. So that creates a bit of a, sometimes some may say it's sort of a confusing situation, but the idea is that ultimately all these regional economic communities, all these FTAs will sort of merge with the continental FTA. So the continental FTA marks the beginning of a journey. It's not the end. We are far from it. If you look at the regional integration process, there's a long way to go. In fact, the FTA, as we said at the very beginning of this presentation, is the very first step in the process of deep regional integration. The next stage involves the formation of a continental customs union. So we are not there yet. After that, you have a common market. You may have, at the end of the day, an economic and monetary union, which is what is envisaged in the Abuja Treaty. So we have a long way to go. And also, the launch of the continental FTA last year, let's be clear, we have launched only the first phase of the AFCFTA. The first phase involved an agreement. Again, this is something we're going to talk about. It involves an agreement on trading goods, trading services, dispute settlement. There are a number of unresolved issues, even in phase one. Plus, you have other issues that need to be addressed. Issues such as competition policy, intellectual property rights, e-commerce, investment. These are issues which are currently under negotiation under phase two. So thank you. That will be the end of the first module. We'll move to module 2 in a bit. Thank you.